But we're going to talk Frank Miller's Batman. Obviously the people really like year one, but the incarnation that really, I think, kicked everything off and to me is the unbeatable MVP is the Dark Knight Returns. And then of
Hmm.
course there is, I don't know how you feel about it, Rob, but I think the consensus is the infamy with All-Star Batman and Robin, which
Well, I'll tell you how
suppose
I feel about it.
but I guess in your opinion, t thinking about Frank Miller's Batman as a whole, what makes this a celebrated standout for you?
Well, I think what makes it a celebrated standout in general, I think, is that back in, this book was published in I think 1986, The Dark Knight
Something like
Returns
that.
was. And you know, Batman, let's see. I mean, in the 1960s, we had the camp era that was popularized by the Batman 66 TV show, right? And then
Hmm.
coming out of that in the world of comic books, they darkened Batman up again. Creators like Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, they sort of brought Batman back to his roots as a dark, brooding character. They sent Robin off to college. He did a lot more stuff on his own, things like that. Then in the 80s, Frank Miller came along and kind of took that darkness element to Batman and hit the gas. And, he pushed it really to the nth degree. And Batman became a lot grittier, a lot angrier. And I think that a lot of people at that point in time, certainly the mainstream audience, because, Tim Burton's Batman hadn't come out yet. So this was, I think, a lot of people's first time being exposed to the Dark Knight version of Batman as opposed to the campy version of Batman. And you can talk about how much credit Frank Miller deserves for darkening Batman again and sort of I don't want to say giving Batman his balls back, but sort of making Batman a darker character again. But I think that is really what makes The Dark Knight Returns a standout story amongst Batman stories. The fact that it sort of popularized the Dark Knight again and made him darker than ever. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah, totally. And it is one of those landmark things that changed things forever. I mean, his sales post Dark Knight Returns have really never gone back. Before it was, one thing, and then
Hmm.
after it's completely different. And
Yeah.
actually, we did do an in-depth episode on this book,
Hmm.
episode 259 on our podcast, which apparently debuted on my birthday. Uh,
Hey, there you go.
but um, I think the thing I like about it, speaking just to the Dark Knight Returns, is that,
Hmm.
we do have this older Batman who's like mulling over
Yes.
his age. It's this different world he has going on. And
Hmm.
I like books that take a little bit of a cultural mirror to what's going on at the time. You can kind of
Yes.
get that vibe. Obviously, it's very much in a Frank Miller stylistic way, but it's the 80s, it's Reaganism. There's a lot
Hmm.
that he's incorporating just from like being a person in the world that I
Yeah,
think.
absolutely. It was very relevant to what was going on at the time.
So I think that's cool. And I think that helps, kind of give it a purpose and a point, because I'm
Yeah.
sure since then, we've had different creators do their take on an older Batman. Tom King is one of the more recent ones I could think of with his,
Hmm.
elderly Bruce and elderly Selina married and,
Hmm.
living their life together. But
He sort of went into that alternate future type or
yeah,
what if future thing.
totally.
I mean, one of the things with Frank Miller that I wanted to ask you about is, people read The Dark Knight Returns and they read Frank Miller's take on Batman, and one of the things that you hear, I guess scholars, if you want to call them that, they use the word fascist as it relates to
Mhm.
Batman. Is Frank Miller's Batman a fascist? Because, he's the Batman we see in The Dark Knight Returns and in All-Star Batman and Robin, not as much in year one, but in those two, much more violent. I remember there's a panel where he like goes, kid's not going to be able to walk again, that kind of thing. And of course, he is, rising up and, taking on the establishment, and he gathers an army together. And, I guess he's trying to bring down the established order and impose, to an extent, I guess, impose his will or his brand of justice on the people of Gotham City. I mean, so I guess my question to you, Scott, here, and you didn't prepare for this. I'm springing this on you, so
Yeah.
folks, but do you think that Batman in Frank Miller's world is a fascist? Does he have fascist tendencies? I mean,
I think it's fair to say he might have fascist tendencies. That's a hard question to answer because I think like vigilantism and the whole superhero thing
mm-hmm.
is, essentially people taking things into their own hands and like
Yes.
doling out their brand of justice. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of the reason why we also have like the no kill policy with a lot of heroes at DC is because it kind of keeps
That's
them
right.
towing that line of like maybe not
Mm-hmm.
completely crossing over into fascism because they're not,
Mm-hmm.
outright just like, well, it's done. I killed him. I'm not going to put him in the court system and let the Justice
Yeah.
Department decide. Frank Miller's though, he's older. We don't really see him use the courts in The
Nope.
Dark Knight Returns. And in
No
fact,
people's
everybody's
court in
against
Frank
him.
Miller's universe.
Yeah, he's and Superman comes in as like the government puppet figure, which is probably the
Mm-hmm.
only part of the book where I'm like, I think that's a stretch,
Yeah,
which I feel
that's a
like
different
is
take on.
Frank Miller trying to say that Superman's the fascist, which is,
Mm-hmm.
but
I
I don't.
go ahead.
I don't know. I'm having a hard time saying yes or no on there, and I'm trying to figure out why. Because I think it is such a fine line where I could see people's point. And to what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying about people calling him a fascist, Peter Weller, who did the voice in the animated adaptation, is on record
How
during
about that?
interviews for that, calling him a fascist. He's like, yeah, Batman's a fascist,
Mm-hmm.
like flat out. And I'm like, this is the guy who did the
Yeah,
voice. So,
absolutely. No, I mean, here's the thing. My take on it is, if you look at what that character does on paper, but like in a vacuum,
Mhm.
it does appear fascistic a little bit, but because it's a story and we can see into Batman's heart and we can see into, we more or less know what Batman's intentions are. Uh, because you're right, superheroes have a shade of fascism to them. But because we can see into Batman's heart, and he uses rubber bullets instead of real bullets, and it I don't think he's a fascist in that story. The Dark Knight Returns, I'm speaking of. I think that he's much more extreme, but I wouldn't use the term fascist because I don't think he's trying to take over the city and reshape it in his image. I think he's trying to bring his brand of justice and do right. I don't think he wants to revamp the court systems and make himself judge, jury, and executioner. Does that make
No.
sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, yeah, it's not his goal really is kind of to, take down the mutants, but then you have the Joker coming in and it's like, oh crap, got to deal with
Mm-hmm.
that. And so
Yeah,
it's
and you know what? If he were a fascist, though, wouldn't he have? Because one of the big scenes in that story is where the Joker is paralyzed and he's laying there, he can't move, and he says to Batman more or less, I dare you to kill me," and Batman won't do it because he's got his code of ethics. He will not take a life. So the Joker ultimately has to twist his own neck around and do the deed himself. I think a fascist Batman is one who kills the Joker. I think a fascist Batman is one that tries to murder Superman. I think a fascist Batman is maybe one who kidnaps Robin. More on that in a minute. But yeah, I can see where the argument comes from,
Mhm.
but I don't think it applies to the Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah. I do think though, kind of like what I was saying earlier and what you echoed too, the no kill thing, is if Batman were more like the Punisher, I think we'd be having a different
Hmm.
conversation. So,
Yeah,
but
is the
they
Punisher a fascist? That's a question
Well,
for another time. But is the Punisher a fascist?
I mean, that's the thing though, is he's not really like they don't like to use the hero label with him. They like to kind of distance that. And a lot of creators have said like, hey, yeah, he's doing these things that like kind of benefit society, but he himself is not a good person, you know? Like,
Hmm.
so
Yeah, I mean, I especially in the last 25 years or so. I mean, I would imagine that they would want to have that spin on it. Like I can see
yeah.
why.
And I mean, his
But
first appearance, he was
again,
trying to kill Spider-Man anyways, if I remember right. So,
yeah, exactly. So
um, did you want to talk about All-Star Batman and Robin?
okay. Yeah. Yeah, I do. Yeah, okay. Uh I don't think but okay, getting back to the fascist thing. I don't think Batman is meant to be a fascist. I don't know enough about Frank Miller to tell you whether he's a fascist or not. Okay, so I don't want to get into that argument. Um, one thing I will say is that, this story is panned in a lot of circles, and there are good reasons for that. Okay, there's a lot of crudeness and a lot of chauvinism present in this story, particularly when you get into the portrayals of Vicky Vale and Black Canary. And the first issue especially is very chauvinistic in that respect. I don't, I'm not going to offer an excuse for Frank Miller in that sense. I will say though that if this and he never got to finish All-Star Batman and Robin, right? It went 10 issues. I don't know if it was supposed to go 12 or if we were supposed to get more, but the story to this day remains unfinished. But if the idea was supposed to be um that taking in Robin, taking in Dick Grayson, taking in this kid, bringing him into the world of the Dark Knight or whatever, is supposed to be the element that pulls Batman back from the brink of darkness and pulls him back from, if you want to use the word fascism, you can, but that keeps Batman from going too far into the dark. If that's the point of the story, I can respect that intention. The problem is that Frank Miller went way too far in establishing, I think, that Batman is a was going he went too far in establishing that Batman was becoming this dark, violent, scary person. I mean, the moment, one of the moments, maybe the definitive moment from the story that everybody remembers is the moment where Batman and Dick Grayson, who he has just kidnapped moments after, his parents are murdered because he's apparently been scouting him for some reason. Nothing creepy about that. Um, I don't know, Dick Grayson mouths off to him and he says, and Batman has the famous line, and I'm not going to use the word, but he says, "What are you, dense? Are you R word or something? I'm the goddamn Batman." Like
Yeah.
and then moments later, he smacks him. He smacks Robin. I remember reading that when I was in college and thinking, okay, it's like they were losing me there, but they hadn't lost me yet. Okay. Where they lost me was in issue 7, and that was when Batman takes the bleach and the thermite and he sets a bunch of henchmen or criminals or whatever on fire. Remember that?
Yeah, it's been a while since I read it, but yeah, because I was
Well,
getting
I've,
those when
I've
they
got the
first
issue
came.
next to me, my friend.
Yeah, I've got I was getting the issues when they first came out, and I held on to them for the longest time. I don't know why.
Hmm.
I think it was because it was the Frank Miller thing. I'm like, well, like I have all his other work, might as well keep this. But yeah, I don't know. I
To
feel
me,
like Frank Miller was working through something at that time, and if I remember
yeah,
right, when were those published? Because I
the
feel
early
like
$2000s.
yeah, post 9/11, Frank Miller
Oh yeah,
he was vocal about his opinions about certain things, but
yeah. He was a very angry young man at that time because this was the same era where Holy Terror came out. Do you know Holy
2005.
Terror?
Yeah, I haven't read it personally, but.
You know what? I know of it. I've heard, I've watched reviews of it, but this was the same. Holy Terror came after All-Star Batman, so it wasn't, it wasn't the same guy, but that was kind of the peak of aggressive, too much Sin City Frank Miller. But yeah, the whole Batman sets criminals on fire thing, you can stretch this character in a number of different directions. He's incredibly versatile, but at some point you can stretch him too far and he stops being recognizable as Batman. And to me, that's what Frank Miller ultimately did. And that was the prime offense to me of All Star Batman and Robin. It's when Batman stopped being Batman.